Today we cover two topics that you're almost certainly aware of, but maybe not totally clear on the details. The first is the Electoral College. How does it work? And what happens if we change the rules? The second is China. It's become a major political topic over the last 4 years. But why? What kind of threat could a communist Chinese regime pose to everyday Americans? Today, we take a look under the hood at a uniquely American institution, the Electoral College. It's not well understood, and it's even less well understood why the Founding Fathers came up with it. And every time a candidate wins the Electoral College but loses the popular vote, such as when George W. Bush won in 2000 and Donald Trump in 2016, there's renewed calls to abolish it. We're joined today by M.A. Taylor, a filmmaker who's just released a documentary called Safeguard, an Electoral College Story. And he's going to help us answer some of those questions. Matthew, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Excellent. So you've just done a whole documentary on the Electoral College. Could you just start by explaining to us in the simplest terms possible, how does the Electoral College work?
So the Electoral College is the method on how we elect the executive or the president, as he's more commonly, or he or she is more commonly known. And what it is, it's a system that essentially is devised to have 51 small elections within each of our 50 states plus the District of Columbia. And then the winner of the state has a series of electors who are then sent to vote for the president. So it is actually a two-stage election. And so an elector is an actual person, and the elector represents a district or a place. So, for example, if you take Wyoming, they have 3 electors, which one elector per senator, and then an elector for the congressional seat within the state. So it has 3 electoral votes. So Wyoming votes. Whoever gets the most in the state, the presidential candidate, gets all of the electors, and then they go vote in the Electoral College. And whoever gets 270 electors wins the presidency, or over 270. And that is how we've been selecting the president since the beginning of the country.
And very quickly, which state has the most and how many Electoral College votes do they have? And I guess Wyoming's one of the least with 3.
So currently, California is the largest electors state in the country. I believe it has 55, but the electors change. So they're not always the same. Every 10 years, we do a census. And the reason they change is because it's connected to districts, the districting. So, for example, if a part of a state loses population, they'll redistrict that part, and you may lose a congressional seat, which means you will also then lose an elector. And so, for example, we have a census going on right now, the 2020 census, and I believe that New York will lose 2 of its electoral votes in the upcoming elections because the population has moved to Florida, and Florida will actually be gaining some electoral votes. So I believe it's 29 electoral votes in New York and 27 currently in Florida. And then it will be 27 in New York and 29 in Florida. So, it's not set in stone. The population moves about, but it is a state-based system that basically kind of undergirds the federalist system in this country to select the executive.
I liked in the film the way one person described it, that it's like the World Series. That it's
Yes.
like, it's all the different, you have to win the number of games, right? The number of states.
Yes.
It's not about total of runs. I thought that was a very
Yes.
useful analogy. Okay, so start by explaining to us, where did it come from? What were the Founding Fathers thinking?
Well, in the early days of the country, we were not what people think we were. We were basically 13 disparate colonies that were essentially sovereign states. So, of course, they create this federalist system that is an agreement that, yes, the state is still an independent sovereign, but they agree to come together to create a federal government that's all over all of them. They decide in a single executive. And the question is, how do you select a single executive when you have 13 sovereign entities? And of course, they finally come up with this idea of the Electoral College. And again, if you look at how the electors how are designated, if you have 2 senators per each state, which shows that, look, they're all sovereigns and they're all equals. And then you have proportionate population for your congressional seats. That shows that if the bigger states get more electoral votes, then that is how you bring them all together to select the president. And that's how they are represented. But again, the electors only meet in their states. They never meet together. It puts the elections in the states so that the federal government has no say. The federal government cannot control the election or manipulate the election. It allows the state to have its sovereignty and its independence while operating in this larger space. The Electoral College also allows the country to scale with size. So we start with 13 colonies. As we add states, the Electoral College allows us to add states. It allows us to scale the system. So that's some of the genius of the system and how they put it together and why they put it together. And it's worked for very, very well. We've only had a couple hiccups here and there through the history of the country. And for the most part, it selects the person who wins the most majority. Sometimes it does not. In 5 instances, the popular vote has not lined up with the electoral vote.
So let me get to that. There is, there were just recently a Gallup poll and Pew poll about how many people would like to abolish the Electoral College. And it's some odd, I think 60% or something of Americans would like to abolish it. So why? Now, I get that in the last election, President Trump won the Electoral College, but did not win the popular vote. The same in 2000 with Bush and Gore. But for the most part, like you said, the two will come out the same. So why are so many people wanting to abolish it when it's been working all this time?
And that's the thing. I think the problem is most people don't actually understand how it protects your individual rights. And without the Electoral College, there would be much more electoral chaos, and there will also be you would have a dissemination of how this so that the mob would rule, and that's what the founding fathers were trying to avoid. They did not want direct popular vote. They did not want the mob to rule, because what happens is that introduces tyranny, the tyranny of the majority, and that is really the big thing that they strive to eliminate from the Constitution, was any kind of tyranny. And so the Electoral College helps keep tyranny out of the electoral process. And sometimes people are going to lose. Not everybody wins in an election, but the kinds of people who are elected tend to be more moderate. They tend to be more centrist. They tend to be more candidates for the whole entire country, because the Electoral College drives a candidate to have to be a moderate and more binding candidate versus a candidate that only pitches to one kind of people. And that's really kind of like what the Electoral College does. And if people understood that, they would probably change their opinion to abolishing it outright.
Why is it that they would have to form this broader coalition instead of appealing to one group of people, one constituency?
Well, if it's just 50 plus 1, then I just need one more vote to win, if it's just a national popular vote. And so right now, the way it works is that because the way the country is broken up, you have to have a candidate has to go to different geographical places. You may have voters in Iowa, and you have voters in Florida, and you have voters in Maine. These are very different people. And so if you have to assemble like a puzzle, a number of electors to win the presidency, you have to have a message that resonates with people in Maine and people in Iowa and people in Florida and people in California even. And so the thing is that you can never really become super extreme, because all of these people are different. They're different geographically. They're different in a whole series of ways. And on top of it, it also helps the minority, because the thing is like California has more electoral votes than the next 40 states. If you had a national popular vote, then I would only have to run in California. That's anti-diversity, right? So diversity is having to have a view that operates in many of these states. And really what would be better is that if candidates actually ran in all 50 states, because you would get the most opinions, and you would have a view that works for the most people. And here's the other thing, if you don't have the Electoral College, there will no longer be parties. Right now we have 2 parties, and a lot of people say, oh, there's only 2 parties, I wish there were more. But you have to be careful what you wish for. If there was no Electoral College, you could have 4, 5, 6, 7 parties. And if you have 6 or 7 parties, that means that whoever wins is most likely winning by 20% or 15%. And that is even less democratic than right now, where you're winning by 51-49. So if you have a candidate, and here's the parties could be more extreme. You could have single issue parties. Right now, you don't have single issues. You have a whole variety of issues because everybody is different. Everybody's an individual, and you want to find something that kind of resonates with everybody. And it helps moderate the president and helps moderate the culture. And ultimately, that's kind of what it does. And if you're a minority voice, you're not left out. You're part of the conversation because you could be the majority in your state, even though you're the minority nationwide. And that's what allows people to kind of get more involved in the conversation and not sit out the election.
But isn't it the case that, even though in theory they have to campaign in all 50 states, but generally they focus on the swing states, right? So isn't that just kind of a different way of slicing it?
Well, look, swing states change. In 2004, Missouri and West Virginia were actually swing states. And now West Virginia is super, super, Republican. Other states, such as California, was a Republican state until Bill Clinton.
So what is the main argument for the abolishers?
Primarily the argument is one person, one vote. But I think the motivation is that they want the election system to be federalized, meaning they want the federal government to control our election system. And the founding fathers very clearly lay out that they did not want the federal government to be in control of electing the executive. It defeats the purpose of the executive. They wanted that system to lie with the states. Think of it this way, right? People talk about external forces trying to manipulate American elections. The thing is, it's a lot harder to manipulate 50 different elections, or 50 plus one, including the District of Columbia, than manipulating one area, which would be the federal government for all 50 states. So it just makes it very difficult. They all have different rules. They all have different times in which the polls are open. They're all individual sovereigns. That's the beauty of the system. And so by keeping them just broken apart like this, it protects you from fraud. It protects you from a whole series of things. If you have democratic rule, the problem is we have parts of the Constitution that are anti-democracy. The Bill of Rights, for example. And so. Again, the system is a balance of all of these pieces that are put together to create as much equality as possible. And by eliminating the Electoral College, the way that the national popular vote is going about it, it's an end run around the Constitution. It's damaging, and people will wake up one day realizing they voted a certain way, and that did not happen in their state. And there will be no democracy for places like California who think that they were giving people one person, one vote.
Excellent. Well, extremely informative. Thank you so much for joining us today, Matthew.
Oh, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Coming up after the break, what every American needs to know about communist China, because what happens in Beijing doesn't stay in Beijing. But first, here's America Q&A, where we ask Americans across the country if they can explain the Electoral College.
Oh, wow. I don't think that many people know about exactly what they are.
The Electoral College is a system that sort of it was originally intended to give equal weight to each state.
Yeah. Electoral College was put in place so that it divided out the votes essentially for those outside of the cities. So if we got rid of the Electoral College, which I've heard a few folks talk about, it would be very detrimental.
I do believe that the Electoral College has seen its day. It needs to change. I think that now it should be based on a popular vote.
The Electoral College? No, sir.
I know, it was put in for a reason, that's for sure, but, it seems like at times it's manipulated because the candidates go for the big electoral states and tend to leave other states out.
Oh, I've never heard of that, no.
And the president has to win not just the popular elections, not by the numbers, right? They have to win the state electoral college to become the president of the United States.
Right. So the Electoral College is a hybrid between the nationalism and federalism when our founding fathers created the country, because they wanted to make sure that the majority had a say, but also that the president was selected not just by a concentrated number of people, but a geographically separated number of people.
Over the last 4 years, the national narrative on China has seen a dramatic shift. Trade tensions and reports of human rights abuses that have existed for years are suddenly bubbling to the surface of public consciousness. From the trade wars to the spread of the pandemic, the ban on Huawei from our 5G networks, Beijing's aggression in Hong Kong, the NBA scandals, and the oppression of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo recently talked about China's, quote, desire for global hegemony. So why is China seen as such a threat? Interestingly, this is one of the few issues that Republicans and Democrats often agree on. Today, we tackle the question from 4 angles: the cost to the U.S. economy, Chinese Communist Party's appalling human rights record, the threat posed by technology from China, and finally, the Chinese Communist Party's influence operations in the U.S. and other Western countries. First, we take a look at China's impact on the American economy and why we're in a trade war. China watchers point out that for decades, Chinese companies working hand in glove with the Communist Party have been engaged in unfair trade practices that hurt Americans. Let's talk about how. All right, we're joined today by Curtis Ellis, the Policy Director at America First Policies. Curtis, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to get right into it and talk about the impact of China on the U.S. economy. It's hard to have a discussion about the U.S. economy these days, the direction it's going in, without China coming into the story. Why is China so important to that?
When President Trump imposed tariffs on a wide range of Chinese imports, we saw a parade of U.S. business interests come to the Commerce Department and ask for exemptions on tariffs on, again, a wide range of imported goods. We discovered that everything from Bible printers to oil drillers were dependent on China. You find that American manufacturers of these drill bits are having to compete with Chinese manufacturers who are selling the finished drill bits for less than the cost of the steel that goes into them. And this pattern has been repeated across the spectrum of manufactured and finished goods. China has been using illegal subsidies and other predatory trade practices to undercut American manufacturers. And as a result, jobs that Americans used to have making the things that we use in our everyday lives are now made by Chinese workers in China.
Very interesting. So is this what's at the heart of the trade war?
Yes, absolutely. The Chinese Communist Party has made a deliberate effort to undermine America's economic strength by crippling our ability to manufacture those goods that we depend on in our everyday lives. We saw that with personal protective equipment in the pandemic, but everything from home appliances, coffee makers, air conditioners, all of these things used to be made domestically, but so many of them are now produced in China.
And was that some deliberate policy at the government level, or is that just individual companies making choices along the way?
Well, there's been sort of an unholy alliance. It was a deliberate effort by the Chinese Communist Party waging what they call unrestricted warfare. They realized that the best general defeats the enemy without taking the battlefield. If we were entirely dependent on a foreign power for our manufactured goods, we would be economically dependent on them. And once you're economically dependent, you're politically dependent. Now, the unholy alliance is that we find that Wall Street and large financial interests and the giant global multinational corporations saw a confluence of interests. They would like the cheap labor of China, the subsidized production base in China. They saw that running to their advantage. So they played right into the hands of the Chinese Communist Party in turning China into the world's manufacturing floor. The third part of this involved the Western political class, who long ago bought into the idea of globalism, that nation states would become irrelevant and the central organizing principle of global society would be the multinational corporation, and making it easier for these multinational corporations to move resources from country A over to manufacturing in country B in order to sell in country C, and to rearrange that rearrange that array of markets and labor and resources at will without interference from national governments.
China's economic model is often described as rob, replicate, and replace. Can you explain what that means and maybe give us an example?
Yes, using such means as coercive technology transfer or cyber espionage, the Communist Party, which is synonymous with the government, robs the intellectual property of foreign producers. American companies wishing to get a foothold in the China market are required to take on a Chinese partner and to transfer to that Chinese partner their blueprints and their technology. At that point, the Chinese partner, or a clone or a partner of the partner, if you will, replicates the goods that are being produced with that intellectual property. Having replicated the goods, they then replace the original vendor and starts basically selling the same product that the partnership, the Western and Chinese partnership, used to produce. There was a real blatant example of this with a company that made paper shredders. They found their Chinese partner went in and took over the factory, locked out the Western partner, and then started making the shredders and selling them under a different name in the same market.
And let's move to the stock market. I know that Chinese companies that are listed on U.S. stock exchanges aren't required to have their books audited like every other company that's there, certainly American companies. Why is that allowed? And what are the implications of that?
It's a very good question as to why it's allowed. The short answer is under a memo of understanding that was drawn up, I believe, in 2014 under the Obama-Biden administration. We gave the Chinese companies a pass. The Chinese government considers the books of these companies a state secret and refused to open the books to independent auditors. This really compromises the integrity of our capital markets, which were considered the gold standard for integrity because we had independent auditors, we had standards that applied to everybody. Now, what does this mean for American investors is that when you invest in a Chinese company, you really don't know what you're investing in. There have been a number of huge scandals. The latest involves a Chinese coffee company that was the Chinese version of Starbucks, where they were just making up their sales and their profit and loss statements, making it up out of whole cloth. And it turned out to be entirely fraudulent, so that people whose 401k, their retirement funds, were invested in this company or in these Chinese companies are at serious risk of being defrauded and losing everything. Some of the biggest names on Wall Street are up to their eyeballs in peddling Chinese funds. And I guess that gets to the answer of why were Chinese companies allowed to do this? Again, people saw a chance to make a fast buck. A lot of big players on Wall Street are making a lot of money by playing along with the fiction that Chinese companies are just as solid and transparent and open and reputable as an American company, but they're not.
Very interesting. Well, we're out of time now. Thank you so much for joining us today. The 70-year history of the Chinese Communist Party leaves a long trail of human rights abuses. Today, we talk to an American citizen who tried to expose those abuses in China and ended up in jail for 3 years. So we're joined today by Dr. Charles Li. He's an American citizen who's originally from China, and a highly productive one. He's a medical doctor, a neuroscientist, and he was doing medical research at Harvard. And he was also arrested in China, and the U.S. State Department got involved in his case. There's also a documentary made about his story. Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Let me start by asking you, why were you arrested in China?
Yes, I actually started practicing Falun Gong in 1997, and which is based on principles of truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, because the practice itself is very powerful. So the Communist Party is afraid of losing control over the society, so they started persecution on Falun Gong in 1999. So that's the time when I was thinking about getting into the medicine, being a doctor in our country, in the United States. But because I came from China, I understood how severe this persecution could be, because I understood the evilness of the Communist Party. So I went back to China trying to help. They arrested me and put me in prison for 3 years. So that's the main reason, because I want to tell the truth.
And so what happened to you while you were in prison?
Yeah, they tried everything possible to force me to give up my practice of Falun Gong, and I did not, give in at all. So they tried like 1.5 years trying to, enforce me to give up. So after that, they realized it's not possible to do that. So they forced me to become a sort of prisoner or criminal. So I did not give in either. So. But they forced me to do slave labor, I trying to deprive my sleep. And after I protested, they force-fed me. So they forced me to make like Christmas lights, the shoes and all those things. And the most important and most painful experience was that they used my mother, who was sick at that time, to give me pressure to give up or, listen to them. My mother died, actually, passed away while I was in prison. So that was one of the most evil things I understood, how the Communist Party can use anything they can find to persecute their enemies, so-called.
Actually, I remember seeing in the documentary that you made Homer Simpson slippers. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. We were forced to make many of these things, and that I export to our country. So one of them is Homer Simpson slippers. It's a sort of cartoon character, but that was not funny at all, because it's the condition, labor condition is very bad, very harsh in the prison, and there's no pay at all.
So the Chinese Communist regime said they abolished the forced labor system, but now we hear lots of reports that in Xinjiang, Uyghur Muslims are in similar forced labor camps. What's the connection between the persecution of Falun Gong and the Uyghurs and China's basically history of human rights abuses?
Yeah, I think this is an extremely important issue to all of our American people, because people always took the CCP, the Communist Party of China, as a kind of normal government. Actually, it's not. So when I was in prison, there was a book called Nine Commentaries on Communist Party, published in November of 2004. So that book described the true nature of the Communist Party, and that there are 9 evil genes within the Communist Party itself. One of them, is deceit. They always trying to tell lies, and people don't realize that. So a lot of times they were being just cheated, or fooled by the Communist Party. So go back to the question of the persecution. The human rights abuses is nothing to them. They can do anything. For Falun Gong practitioners, the persecution started in 1999. It's been 21 years already. They have used all evil ways. We have documented more than 100 ways of torturing to the Falun Gong practitioners. One of them is the forced organ harvesting, which means they take the organs out from the Falun Gong practitioners when they're alive, and many of the times they don't use anesthesia, so that means the people will just suffer severe pain and then die after their organs are taken out. So they use this crime like it's like never heard in human history, to not only just eliminate their enemies but also make money, and they get rich by doing so. And those who are very good in persecuting will be promoted within the system. So when we talk about Tibet, Xinjiang, and many other minority groups and other religious groups, the persecution has been going on for many years. All these methods has been practiced by the Communist Party. Then they have been used to other groups of people in China as well. In recent years, we see that these CCP infiltration all over the world, actually, including our country. So that is a very alarming signal to all human beings, because it's like the Communist Party, they have this ambition to control the world, to dominate the world. So they actually on surface they take the United States as number one enemy, because our country is founded on the human rights and the respect to freedom and democracy. So that's the things the Communist Party hates the most. So they're not going to stop until they overthrow the government of the United States, or replace the government with somebody they can use, they can control.
And why do you think average Americans should care about what's going on in China and the human rights abuses?
They can do so many things, and they have accumulated so much money in the past 20 years, so they can buy a lot of so-called bad people in other countries to serve their interest. Like we see, like in the One Road, One Belt initiatives, they have bought a lot of government officials in other countries, and then they control many countries like Sri Lanka and many African countries. So this is the way for them to expand their influence and to control the world. And in our country, we also see a lot of corruption cases connected to the Communist Party, and they got a lot of money from the Communist Party, and they speak for the Communist Party. And also, it's kind of joke. The money the CCP pays to these people is like peanuts comparing to what they can get from our country or from the world. So it's extremely alarming, to us. We have to watch out and find out who is really connected to the Communist Party and serve their interest.
So if there's one thing that you would like the average American to know about the Chinese Communist Party and current state of things in China, what would it be?
I think the most important thing is to cut off all the ties to the Communist Party for everybody. And also, I think it's difficult for many young people in this country to understand. Many people have, become communists themselves in our country. So this is a big lesson. You have to go read the non-commentaries on the Communist Party, this book.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome.
Coming up after the break, we continue to dig into the reality of the threat posed to Americans by Communist China. But first, here's America Q&A, where we ask Americans across the country, what stance do you think the U.S. government should take on China?
Well, I don't think there's an easy answer for any relationship with our country and any other country.
If the people don't stand up for themselves in their respective country, there's nothing you can do.
I think right now the Trump is going against China right now because the issue with the COVID, he's kind of emphasizing this COVID came from China too, right? And there's not much transparency. That's a big thing with China right now.
I don't know, maybe some political actions, but nothing economical.
Well, I think China is a valuable trading partner. And obviously we can't stop trade with China. They are a big market for us as well as them a big market. But I think it needs to be definitely a more balanced trade.
As far as China goes, we've lost a lot of our industry to China.
For 10 years, we've actually been trying to get into the Chinese market. But because of the censorship that is created over there, we could not get it in. And it's supposed to be a book that's inspiring to everybody, not just American, not just Chinese, but for everybody in the world.
We should make our own drugs. Our car parts should be made here. Our medical devices should be made here. Obama and Biden gave this country away.
Well, human rights are really important.
There should be consequences for the cyber policy and their cyber attacks on the U.S. and their influence on elections.
One of the greatest threats posed by Communist China comes from the far-reaching tentacles of technology. Technology we use every day. I'm here with Casey Flemming. He actually founded IBM's cyber division, and for the last 10 years, he's been the CEO and founder of an intelligence security firm called BlackOps Partners. Casey, welcome.
Glad to be here.
So why don't you start by giving me a big picture of why it is that the current administration has been going after Chinese tech firms like Huawei and now TikTok, WeChat. Why is there this great concern about Chinese tech companies? What's the threat to America?
Well, the average person is not aware of really what's going on behind the scenes. And this administration has the intelligence, and so does our firm, has very similar intelligence showing really what the big picture is. So the average American's not aware of that. They just see technology, let's use it. And, privacy is not a big deal. We don't like it, but we give everything that we possibly can to our smart devices and our computers. So.
Okay, so what is the bigger picture?
Well, for the layperson, it's a different type of a war that we're not aware of. It's called unrestricted hybrid warfare. Unrestricted means they follow no rules. All the other war that we've ever had in the past had rules, like the Geneva Convention and so on. And hybrid warfare means achieving military objectives through non-military means. So it's warfare against every American and every citizen in the free world, using everything that they possibly can to weaken our societies and our democracy so they can control and ultimately take over our democracies.
I see. So, okay, the technology part is just one piece of that puzzle. But what can they do? Why is it important to try to ban Huawei, TikTok, WeChat? What can they do to an American with that?
Great question. So the issue is you're a target. Every one of us are targets, both as a citizen, as an employee, and our companies and our universities are all targets. So when we're putting data into our phones, all of that data is accessible to the Chinese Communist Party. And remember that information is being weaponized against you, to use it against you to harm you currently. And the most immediate is to steal intellectual property. And you say, well, why do I care? Because our economy is built on intellectual property. And the reason you care is stealing, it's not just the money, which is estimated to be over $600 billion a year in raw theft, but it's the time. It's not just the money, it's the time. So if it takes 7 years to develop a chip, a new microchip technology, or a new cancer drug, or really anything that powers our economy, you're erasing the requirement for time, and you're basically on par now with people who did it squarely and fairly under laws. Number two, they're collecting every piece of information on every American man, woman, and child, every British, Canadian, Australian man, woman, child. And when it comes down to actually maybe fighting us or making us hurt, they're going to do everything they are doing everything they possibly can by collecting every bit of data and using artificial intelligence to strategically target companies, military, government agencies, universities, and citizens. And let me remind you, when you pull an app off of your phone, it doesn't leave your phone. So the capability is still there. So if you pull TikTok or WeChat or any one of these weaponized applications off of your phone, it's still tracking it. They know where you went today, how long you stayed at each location. They know when you went to sleep, how long you slept, what websites you've visited. They've got all of your pictures, all of your emails, all of your intellectual property, who you've been emailing, both at business and personal. So it's a weaponized platform. You have to understand your adversary and what their true strategy is. The Chinese Communist Party does not ever want to coexist with anyone. The United States has just woken up to that. You've got Secretary of State Pompeo came out. He, as well as the head of the FBI, Christopher Wray, The head of the DIA, the NSA, and the DOJ came out on the same day and basically had the same speech, that this experiment that we've been partnering with China on and hoping that they would become a democratic society and they would mutually and peacefully coexist has been a severe and utter mistake. And we've created a Frankenstein that the rest of the free world must unite upon to deal with this growing threat.
Wow. Well, you've said a lot there, and there's so many things I'd like to go back to. But one of the things I guess I want to ask is, if I wipe the app off my phone and that actually didn't mean anything, it kind of leaves me feeling a little bit hopeless. Is there anything that people can do? I guess you could throw out your phone and start again, but considering how far it's gone from what you've described, how deep the tentacles are, is it too late?
It's getting there. You can still, when you get a new phone, you can do a complete startup on a fresh phone. But if you're updating or restoring that phone from your old phone, you're restoring the software that's on there. And the software is designed, when you weaponize software, and even so, even American companies, and I'm not going to say weaponize, but they leave footprints because they sell this data to other companies. Google, Microsoft, Apple, they all sell this data to other companies. They also, some of them have actually been selling the data back to China. I know it's difficult for people to understand that this is not conspiracy theory, especially when the Secretary of State comes out and the head of the FBI says, no, it's not conspiracy theory. This is for real. It's not hopeless, but just be cautious of what you're doing on your phones. And when you get a new phone, I'd like to challenge you to start fresh. Store your pictures on your computer, that kind of thing, but start fresh and don't restore your old phone to your new phone, and be really darn careful of the apps that you put on the phone. And certainly no app that is coming from China, like TikTok, WeChat, and there's about 50 apps that you want to be aware of coming from China, because they are all weaponized applications. And any technology coming from China, whether it's a computer manufactured in China, that's Lenovo, their cloud service, which is called Baicells, Huawei, ZTE, all of those, I personally, it's our advice, my advice personally, don't buy any technology whatsoever. That even means a cable or a cord that's manufactured in China.
Why a cable or a cord?
That can be loaded with malware that can infect your computer. It can be, one of those little square blocks that you plug in, and then you plug your USB into that. Those blocks have malware in it. Even electric toasters, washing machines manufactured in China, air conditioners manufactured in China are all issues. And by the way, this battle is only getting worse as we go into the IoT, the Internet of Things, and so on. We've been running an intelligence group for over a decade. And when I tell you that the Chinese Communist Party is absolutely evil, take my word for it.
So let me if you can answer me very quickly on this. I'm an average American. I'm not an intelligence asset. I'm not doing high-level research. Why should I care that the Chinese Communist Party has all that information on me?
Because you're being targeted, and you can be blackmailed, and they're looking to how to get. So in other words, if you're close to IP and the critical intellectual property, they're putting our companies out of business. Energy windmills, all that technology was developed in the United States. Now over 66% are sourced and bought through China. And the same thing with solar panels, developed in the United States. 90% of solar panels are manufactured in China. So you're looking at a systematic destruction of the free world and our economies. So you care what's going on your phone. You care the information that you put on it, and you care about the apps that you put on it. So you have to understand, you're at war, whether you like it or not. I'm talking to your audience, are at war. And just realize it's not going to change. It's not going to get easy anytime soon. It's not headed in that direction. I hate to be the bearer of that news, but hopefully your audience is kind of like me. I mean, whatever it is, I want to know the truth, even though it might not be rainbows and puppy dogs.
Well, so that's a lot to digest and a lot of alarming information. I'm sure a lot of people will want to find out more. Is there somewhere they can go to find out more about this?
Absolutely. When I remember getting into this, I remember, no, this isn't happening. This can't be happening. And it took me probably a couple of months of getting hit every day to understand, oh my gosh, this is really happening. So I would direct your audience to our company page on LinkedIn. We actually connect the dots on a daily basis. We publish probably a half a dozen to a dozen articles every day underneath this headline of unrestricted hybrid warfare. And you'll be able to connect the dots to see really what's going on through the company page on LinkedIn, BlackOps Partners.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Cindy. It's my pleasure.
A major prong of the Chinese Communist Party's strategy to overtake the United States as a global superpower is its influence operations. This may sound like 007 stuff, but it's far more common than most people realize, as you're about to hear. We're joined by Joshua Philipp, senior investigative reporter with the Epoch Times. Josh, thanks for joining us.
Hey, my pleasure, Cindy. Some good topics to go into.
Yes, so why don't we jump right into it? We're talking about influence operations by the Chinese Communist Party. Can you just tell us, what does that mean exactly?
With the Chinese Communist Party, they regard ideology, influence, as being one of the main targets when waging war against another country. Written into their military code, they have what's called the three warfares doctrine: psychological warfare, altering the way you interpret information; media warfare, controlling outlets of information; and legal warfare, the manipulation of international legal systems. The idea is simple. If you can conquer the ideology, if you can conquer the culture, if you can conquer how a country regards another country, regards another idea, regards another policy, and regards its own history, you can replace its system with your own. You can conquer them from within. You can take them over ideologically. With the Chinese Communist Party and these different types of warfare, this is what they're doing.
So how are they accomplishing this? What are they actually doing?
When you go to the polls, who do you vote for? When you go to the market and say buy a product, which newspaper do you buy? Which products do you buy? For example, when you look at the news, what's your perception of China? Do you see it as this up-and-coming superpower that's misunderstood? Or do you see it as a totalitarian regime that has been abusing its own people by the tens of millions since the very get-go? How do you perceive it? Well, your perceptions on it are going to shape the future policy, because the person you vote for is going to determine how the U.S. regards China, how we trade with China. Would you support a product, for example, if you know that it's being manufactured by slaves in Xinjiang, for example? Or are you going to boycott that product? Your ideology, psychology impacts markets, it impacts politics, it impacts the future of a country.
So how does the Chinese regime go about influencing Americans to think the way it wants it to think?
This is not propaganda like we would normally think of it. Psychological warfare is changing the conclusions you come to when looking at otherwise accurate information. For example, when the Chinese Communist Party pushes into the South China Sea, do you regard this as a hostile takeover? Or do you regard it as something they're doing under historical ownership? The historical ownership narrative is their psychological warfare narrative. If you look at the history of the Chinese Communist Party, do you view it in terms, again, of a totalitarian regime that took over the country and killed 50 million to 70 million people? Or do you see it as a country that lifted its people out of poverty? Again, the lifting them out of poverty narrative, that is the Communist Party's narrative. That is the narrative used to justify its actions. These are all tied to psychological warfare. Why does the Chinese Communist Party censor the internet? Why does the Chinese Communist Party have programs to censor journalists? Why do academics have to self-censor or risk being kicked out of the country? Why is it that if someone in the MBA criticizes the Chinese Communist Party and supports democracy, the entire MBA gets punished? It's because ideology is the CCP's biggest weak point. They have different systems targeting journalists, targeting academics, targeting politicians in our country. And they also have systems to censor us on social media, to prevent influencers like NBA from speaking out against the Chinese Communist Party. Anyone can be targeted by it if you speak out against them and you have enough influence. They will target you. They will try to silence you. They will attack the people around you. They will attack your business.
So how is it that they can control academics and businesses? You talked about denying visas, that kind of thing, but are they doing it on American soil also?
Yes, they're doing it on a very large scale on American soil. One of the main operations in the U.S. is called the United Front Work Department. They operate this out of their different consulates. There's the United Front Work Department, works hand in hand with the OCAO, the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office. They also have the Confucius Institutes. They also have the Chinese Student and Scholar Associations. They have many different programs directing these operations. They also have, for example, influencer organizations, influence over think tanks, influence over academics. And they can use all of these to influence what is being said in our media. You know, who are the journalists speaking to when they write about China? What happens if they subvert the academics giving the interviews to the media? Where do governments get their policies from? Where do they get their analysis in China from? They get it from think tanks, they get it from academics. What happens if the think tanks and academics have cooperation agreements or are taking money from China? During a single analysis at Texas A&M University, what was historically a military university, they found that close to 100 different faculty members were taking foreign gifts, among them China. What about ones that are not, have this military history? What about ones that do not have that foundation of patriotism? How many academics are working on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party? How many of them are giving interviews to media? How many of them are writing papers that are influencing our political systems? The CCP has many programs working on every single facet of how information flows, of how people in government are informed, of how businesses are informed about their purchasing decisions, about whether, say, investors are willing to put their money into China, or they say it's too risky, or they say, I don't want to support the politics happening there right now. And it understands that by influencing the people of power, influencing the elite of a country, which is what the United Front and Work Department works on, that they can influence the direction of that whole country.
So why are these elites, whether they're in business or politics or culture or sports, why do they go along with it? Are they being duped? Is it greed? Is it lack of patriotism? Like, why do they go along with it?
There's a few different reasons. These are normal people, academics, journalists, professors, sometimes politicians, business leaders, sometimes students. And the way the Chinese Communist Party subverts them is they look for moral weaknesses. That is money, that's greed, right? It's lust, honey traps, using pretty girls or pretty boys to subvert you, to get you, basically in blackmail traps. They use power, using, say, the front operations, the front organizations like the United Front, having tongs, these fraternal organizations, sometimes with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of members, who they can mobilize to support your cause, support your political campaign, and so on. They use all these different systems. If you're an academic and you've gone your whole life writing papers that nobody reads probably, or very few people read, and suddenly you get an invite to China saying, we recognize everything you've done. We think you're a genius. We think you're unrecognized. Come to China. We'll roll out the red carpet for you. We'll get hundreds of students to come and applaud you. Your dream will come true. And then guess what? You'll be slowly subverted to work on behalf of another government. That is what they're acting on. A lot of people get so deep into it so fast without even realizing that they have been targeted and they become foreign agents of another government.
Wow. All right. So I want to wrap up, but I have one last question I want to ask you. So for an average American, how much does this touch their lives and what would they need to be aware of?
I'd say for the average American, this is one of the biggest threats to our country. This is the slow takeover of the country that we know. We could wake up one day and we can find every one of our facilities, every one of our faculties, right? Basically be working for another government, working on behalf of another people. Now, when it comes to communism, what's one of the main goals? Seize the means of production. Who controls the means of production? What are those? Who controls manufacturing? Who controls the factories? Who controls, research and development? Who controls the natural resources? Who controls logistics? Who controls the raw materials of every country in the world? Who controls the GDP products that are the basis of these countries? Who controls the critical infrastructure? If the Chinese Communist Party does not currently own it, they're making an effort to own it. And if we let this go on, we're going to wake up one day and realize we've become a vassal state of the Chinese Communist Party. And there are many countries right now, as we speak, that are waking up already and seeing that's happened to them.
Okay, then I have to ask one last question. What can we do? Quickly wrap it up for us. Give us some hope at the end of this.
In terms of hope, the biggest weakness with ideology is truth. And when it comes to recognizing exactly what they're doing and standing up against it and speaking out against it and saying, we recognize exactly what you've done. We know exactly who the people you've gone to. We know exactly how you're doing what you're doing, and we see through your lies. And we're not afraid if you call us out. We're not afraid if you ban us from China. We're not afraid of you to, go on Twitter and call us names. It's standing up, speaking out against it, and calling out the individuals who defend it. Because the Chinese Communist Party, its biggest weak point, its glass jaw, the most fragile part of the entire system is ideology, because its entire system is built on lies. This is why they censor the internet. This is why they censor academics. This is why they do everything they can to criticize a politician, flying jets over the country if a politician goes and visits Taiwan, because they are afraid of ideology. This is why if students go out and protest, not even millions, a few, tens of people, go and protest on the streets of Hong Kong, they will rapidly arrest them. It's why if, a handful of students and teachers in Inner Mongolia protest against the language program, the Chinese Communist Party will send in the military. It is terrified of people waking up. It is terrified because it knows that ideology is its weakest point. And if people begin speaking out against it, really the Chinese Communist Party can't stand the light of day.
All right, well, extremely interesting. Thank you so much for joining us today, Josh.
My pleasure.